Baobhan Sith, Tam Lin Tristan, Lady Spinel, and Morgan's daughter. But what about the Baobhan of Fate Grand Order? How well does she compare to her mythological counterpart, and what grade would I give her depiction? Let's get into it. Baobhan Sith is an archer class servant, which is clearly a case of the Tam Lin name playing a decisive role, because Baobhan doesn't really fit archer otherwise. Sure, she's taken up a bow to use, but based on what the rest of her attacks seem like, Baobhan seems more like a caster than an archer. Indeed, rather than the class skill independent action common to archers, she has territory creation, which suits casters. She is also being taught magic by Morgan, which only further deepens that caster connection. As for the mythical Baobhan Sith, finding a class choice here is harder, perhaps somewhere between a caster and a berserker. In other words, Baobhan Sith probably should be a caster, but her Tam Lin name of Tristan has her take up archer instead. Getting into her character design, Baobhan Sith is a bit different from her other Tam Lin. Whereas Melusine and Barcast wear combat gear in their first ascensions, and more fancy outfits in their second, Baobhan Sith does the opposite, though she does fight in both of these outfits. The first ascension is a more formal outfit, and this is what we see Baobhan the most in. Her second ascension is called a traditional combat fairy outfit when it is first unveiled during the second duel in Gloucester between Baobhan Sith and Artoria Caster. I'm guessing they don't really worry about physical combat too much. But for those of you who are thinking, oh, this is just fan service, there is actually more to it. While the mythical Baobhan Sith were noted as wearing long, flowy dresses, they are also, in essence, a succubus fairy vampire. So wearing an outfit that is meant to be, shall we say, alluring, that's less random than you might expect. As for the third ascension, this is how she ends up after losing her Tam Lin name, her whole being breaking down. Every worry and insecurity that affects Baobhan rises to the surface, making her much more unhinged, as hard as that is to believe, but doing so in a way that is more sad than scary. As for her appearance in general, Baobhan Sith is very pale, which makes sense because, well, she's a vampire. I'll say more about this later, but this is a solid link to the mythological Baobhan Sith. Unfortunately, something else about that myth hurts Baobhan Sith's character design that I have to bring up. Now normally I don't put too much stress upon what colors are specifically used in a design, so long as it's not too outrageous compared to what you would expect. I wouldn't expect Edmond Dantes to be dressed up in bright pink, for example. But when literally every single thing I've read about the mythical Baobhan Sith mentions that the long flowing dresses they wore are green, then it catches my attention. This hurts me to say because, fun fact, red is my favorite color, and I personally really like Baobhan Sith's design. But if every source keeps saying that the dress is supposed to be green, I have to say something about it, you know? Regardless, Baobhan Sith's character design is pretty good, with some creative changes being made. Also, don't worry, I didn't forget about the shoes. We will get to them later. Getting into her skill set, Baobhan Sith's first skill is Grimalkin, increasing quick card effectiveness for 3 turns, providing 1 turn of invincibility, providing 1-time evasion to all allies with no time limit, but also decreasing allies' HP by 500 except for herself. Grimalkin is a cat, sometimes a fairy cat, that appears in numerous tales of European literature, including Shakespeare's Macbeth. However, Grimalkin is also the name of Baobhan Sith's master during her days serving at Darlington, prior to being made a Tam Lin and Morgan's heir. He was the one who had her use her vampiric abilities to raise human corpses, eventually leading to a massive zombie outbreak. Anyway, since she served Grimalkin for many years, it makes sense that she would have picked something up from him, in this case the quicker reflexes one would expect from a cat. A good connection to her Lost Belt 6 story, but otherwise unrelated to Tristan or the myths of Baobhan Sith. Next up, her second skill is Blessed Scion, inflicting MP and skill seal to all enemies for a turn, as well as up to a 30% MP charge at level 10. This skill is meant to represent Baobhan Sith's authority, since she is Morgan's designated heir to the throne of Fairy Britain. Basically, she is wielding her magic to make the field conditions more to her advantage, while also weakening it for her foes. While this is an amazing skill in both gameplay and in lore when it comes to her character in Lost Belt 6, it isn't connected to the mythical Baobhan Sith. There is apparently a connection between this and the original Tristan though, since he was said to have a special status among the knights of King Arthur. Now while Tristan did save Arthur's life at least once, I've struggled to find anything about the two having a particularly special connection. If anyone knows more about this, please let me know. Lastly, Baobhan Sith's third skill is Faerie Vampirism, which takes up to 3000 HP from a single enemy and gives it to Baobhan Sith, has up to a 100% chance to reduce that enemy's MP charge by 1, and also gives Baobhan up to 30% more MP charge. Now this skill is directly linked to the mythical Baobhan Sith, since they are literally fairy vampires. Honestly, I don't really feel the need to say much else. This skill is excellent both for gameplay and from a lore perspective.
わからないまま死んじゃえばベッチベイルノート
Babanshi's noble phantasm is Fetch Fail Not, whereupon she targets a single enemy, creates a shadow version of them, and then uses a hammer to drive a stake into the shadow, causing a massive amount of spikes to burst out of the original enemy. This MP applies Sure Hit to Babanshi for a turn, inflicts Curse upon an enemy for 5 turns, and also inflicts Disastrous Curse upon the enemy, which increases curse damage to that target depending upon overcharge. So let's start with the name. Fail Not is an obvious reference to Tristan and his bow, though this MP has no bow in it at all. The fetch part, however, refers to that magecraft that Beryl taught Babanshi, which she used against Woodwoes and would play a major part in her collapse during Lost Belt 6. Beryl had her use the magic knowing full well that it rots the soul of the one who uses it. Hopefully that is no longer the case. Anyway, one fun thing about this MP animation, Babanshi is using a hammer to drive a stake into her enemy. Let me say that again. A vampire is driving a stake into someone. Also relating to the vampire thing, there's quite a bit of blood in this MP too, as well as the rest of her attack animations for that matter. Since the Babanshi of Myth doesn't really have any MP that comes to mind, the servant getting a skill that blends her Tam Lin name with what she learned in story from Beryl can work. At the very least, we have clear nods to her vampiric nature in the animation. Bavanshi's craft essence is Awkward Gratification, featuring some fancy shoes in a display case. Now, normally I'd have talked about this in the section on character design, but I decided to wait until now. What's up with Bavanshi's interest in shoes? Well, as it happens, it kinda is lore related. Do you remember the bit I mentioned about the Babanshi wearing long green dresses? Well, they wore those partially to hide their feet, which are actually hooved. It is the one clearly inhuman aspect of their appearance, and so is what would give them away before feasting upon their prey. Now, our Babanshi obviously does not have hooved feet, but the fact that she doesn't is a very clear design choice, and as a nod to that, they gave her this interest in shoes and feet. Kind of a way of saying, we know this isn't accurate, but we're gonna do this to let you know that we know this isn't accurate, but we still wanted to give a nod to how it's supposed to be. And you know what? That's fine. It is technically a hit to accuracy, which is what these videos are about, but this is a cool way of them showing that they at least did their research, you know? Because of that, I am much more forgiving about this. Now for characterization. Like with Melusine and Barghest, we are going to start by saying a few words about the myths surrounding Babanshi. A Babanshi is a type of fairy originating in Scotland, and is actually one of the oldest myths of vampiric creatures out there. Much like with Barghest, Babanshi is not one specific being, but rather a type of creature. Indeed, Babanshi tended to move in packs, and they are always female. They would appear before men, often hunters, shape-shifting into attractive women with long green dresses, and offer the promise of company, if you know what I mean. But as the men and the Babanshi danced together, the men would be entranced until, before they knew it, their throats would be cut open and their bodies drained of their blood. Men were the preferred target of Babanshi. If a woman was killed by one, she would become a Babanshi herself. As is typical with vampires, Babanshi are nocturnal, but their only weaknesses are either iron, a typical weakness of fey creatures, or someone finding a Bavanshi's daytime resting place and burying them while they sleep. In short, a Babanshi is a fairy vampire that is somewhat similar to a succubus, seeking to seduce its prey before killing them. Also like Barghest though, actually comparing characterization between the myth of Babanshi and the character in FGO is very difficult, since you don't really get much in terms of a character from these myths. However, there are some links we can make. First and foremost, the Babanshi is a predator, preying upon men who find themselves wishing for female company. Our Bavan is much less discriminating when it comes to gender, but considering that it is said that Babanshi has killed over 400,000 fairies in the 100 years she has been Tam Lin Tristan, I'd say predator is quite a fitting description. Seriously, that's a crazy body count, almost at a rate of 11 fairy kills per day. I know that might not sound like much to the video gamers out there, especially the strategy gamers, but seriously, that's a lot of killing. As for being into seduction, this one is a little less obvious, but connections are still there. Aside from the whole deal about her second ascension, we also know that prior to being made a Tam Lin, Babanshi worked as a prostitute for the fairy Grimalkin. Also, in a single line of Barghest's character profile, Babanshi says that she's the type to pump and dump while commenting on Barghest's love interests. To me, this sounds like Babanshi tends towards one-night stands, but maybe I'm misreading this. In any case, while these are only small details, it at least gives the hint that the Babanshi of FGO is versed in seduction. Be careful. So in the areas that we can assess, the connections between the Babanshi of Legend and the one we have in FGO are pretty good. But of course, there is more to the character of Baobhan Sith in Fate Grand Order. Much like with Barghest, the designers took an existing myth and used it as a base to build off of. She's certainly an interesting character, a vicious and cruel fairy, but made so under the guidance of Morgan. Like Morgan, Baobhan Sith was brutally taken advantage of by the fairies of Britain, and so Morgan taught her to be hedonistic and vicious, since at least then Baobhan Sith would not become a victim yet again. Baobhan Sith has come to hate every British fairy she comes across, having an instinctive revulsion whenever she encounters one, which is all the time. This is what makes her first encounter with Artoria Castor so important. Baobhan Sith has a fairly normal conversation with Artoria, then finds herself wondering why, for once, she doesn't absolutely hate her like everyone else. Under other circumstances, Artoria Castor and Baobhan Sith might have even become friends, but things would not turn out that way. After all, the reason Baobhan Sith didn't instinctively hate Castoria is because she isn't a British fairy, but a fairy of paradise, just like Morgan. But since Artoria is the second Avalon Le Fay, and so is the fairy equivalent of Morgan's true daughter, Morgan's adopted daughter ends up feeling more than a little threatened. The two end up becoming rivals, or rather a one-sided rivalry. Baobhan Sith had been raised from the gutter of fairy British society to become Morgan's heir, and anything that threatens her position is a source of extreme anxiety. As Baobhan Sith continues to fight Artoria, and continues to lose, her mental state worsens more and more, culminating in her losing her position after stealing the garden from Morgan, taken in one last attempt to beat Artoria. But this wasn't the only thing that caused Baobhan's decline. The other, and probably more important factor, was her involvement with Beryl Gut. Now, we know what kind of person Beryl is, and to his credit, he freely admits it, as he did in Olympus after backstabbing Kirstaria. Unfortunately, Baobhan Sith wasn't there to see that, and so what she sees is someone like herself, a guy close to Morgan that has a fondness for murder. As mentioned before, Beryl taught her the magecraft called Fetch, which she uses as her MP. Unfortunately, this rots the soul of the one who uses it, and so contributed greatly to Baobhan Sith's physical and psychological decline. Now, I didn't pick this up at first, but this story of someone who becomes infatuated with another, but later ends up falling victim to a horrible poison that claims their life? Where have we heard a story like this before? Oh yeah, the original Tristan. There are differences, of course. Tristan is male while Baobhan Sith is female. Isolde returned Tristan's affections while Beryl clearly didn't give a damn about Baobhan Sith, and so on. But by having this subplot within Lost Belt 6, the writers actually end up creating a closer connection to the original Tristan than anything found in Baobhan Sith's design or skill set. Baobhan Sith's story ends up having parallels with another character too. As she rots away the night before the final battle at Camelot, she is abducted and taken hostage by Spriggan, part of the scheme to take down Morgan. Not willing to risk her daughter's life, Baobhan Sith can only watch as Morgan is murdered right in front of her, only to then have her own life ended anyway when she is thrown into the Great Pit. While Baobhan Sith may have deserved some retribution for all the murder she did in Fairy Britain, the fact remains that this was a reaction to all the vicious abuse she had suffered again and again. Baobhan Sith had once been a kind fairy who did her best to try to help others, and that kindness was repaid with scorn and violence. After all, the fairies of Britain are rotten to the core, purely focused on their immediate desires, and concepts like loyalty or gratitude are very rare. As Baobhan Sith finds herself thrown into the Great Pit, at last fully giving in to despair, she makes a prayer to another, a being who, like her, had also once been kind to the fairies of Britain, only to have that repaid with murder. That being, whose corpse lay at the bottom of the Great Pit she was falling down, would receive Baobhan Sith's plea, and her spirit would reawaken the dead god. Cernunnos would arise again to unleash his and Baobhan Sith's revenge upon the fairies of Britain, and by the time he was finally defeated by Chaldea, most of Fairy Britain would be dead. Like with the other members of the Lost Belt 6 cast, Baobhan Sith's story is expected to continue into the future. She will of course make an appearance in Summer 8, where the link between her and Cernunnos is made even more obvious. But I also believe that she will be a part of other events as well. While the circumstances made it impossible in Fairy Britain, she does apparently form a friendship with Artoria Castor in Chaldea. Also, in the Mystic Eyes Symphony event, she finds a friend in Galatea, and the two of them go on a bit of an adventure involving shoes. I don't know much about either of these events, but I have every reason to believe that they are much more lighthearted than Lost Belt 6. So, much like other servants I have covered, like Fran, Sanson, and her mother Morgan, Baobhan Sith seems to have a future in Chaldea that is much better than what she experienced in life. After all, the number of British fairies in Chaldea is tiny. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Baobhan Sith's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, it's pretty good. Her character design and skill set are decent, but with some creative license taken for her appearance. As for characterization, much like with Barghest, the creators decided to take a mythical creature from legend, this time from Scotland rather than England, and expanded upon it to create a new character. This new character has good connections to the original myth, and through storytelling, ends up also creating a good link to her Tam Lin identity, Tristan. Nevertheless, she is very much her own character, an original creation of the developers who took existing legends to make something new. And honestly, I'd say they did a good job. So for a final grade, I'm going to give Baobhan Sith, Tam Lin Tristan, a B. So, funny thing, this means that the grades I've given for the 3 Tam Lin have ended up being the opposite of their strength rankings. Baobhan Sith gets the highest grade, but is the weakest of the Tam Lin, while Melusine, the strongest of the Tam Lin, ended up with the lowest grade. I'd say Melusine might want to kill me for this, but I just pulled a copy of her with only 10 tickets, so maybe she still likes me. I hope so. Anyway, if you would like to learn more about the character who adopted Baobhan Sith, check out my video on Morgan here. Until next time.